The Anderson family had always prided themselves on their Christmas traditions. Every year they would decorate the house from top to bottom, transforming their home into a festive wonderland. But this year, as they prepared for the holiday season, they discovered something that would change their lives forever. It all began when Sarah, the mother, was rummaging through boxes in the attic, looking for old ornaments and decorations. The attic was filled with dust and cobwebs, a place she rarely ventured. As she sifted through the old crates, something caught her eye, a small antique doll lying abandoned at the bottom of a box. It was a delicate thing, with glassy eyes that seemed almost too lifelike. Its porcelain skin was chipped, and its hair, once golden, had long since faded into a dull, matted mess. The dress it wore was an old-fashioned faded lace, almost completely worn away by time. Sarah's first thought was to toss it aside, but something about it lingered in her mind. She couldn't bring herself to do it. "Mum, what did you find?" called out her young daughter Lily, who had been helping her decorate downstairs. "Just an old doll," Sarah replied, carefully lifting it from the box. "It's probably too old to keep, but I'll show it to you." Lily's face lit up when she saw it. "It's so pretty, Mommy." She reached for the doll, her small hands eagerly taking it from her mother's arms. Sarah chuckled. "Well, it's not exactly what I would call pretty, but if you like it, I suppose we can keep it around." They placed the doll on the shelf in the living room, among the Christmas decorations. It seemed harmless enough, but over the next few days, things began to change. Late one night, as the house settled into the quiet stillness of sleep, Sarah was woken by a soft, creaking sound. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the house shifting, but the sound continued. Creak, creak, like the groan of old wood under the weight of something heavy. Her eyes flicked to the living room. There, on the shelf, the doll sat perfectly still. But for a moment, Sarah thought she saw it move, just a slight shift in its position, as if it had turned its head ever so slightly toward her. Shaking her head, Sarah blamed it on her overactive imagination and settled back into bed. But the creaking persisted, and now there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible whisper, like a voice calling from somewhere deep within the walls. The next morning, Lily woke up excited. She had slept with the doll, clutching it tightly in her arms, and had even named it Emmy. Sarah tried to laugh it off, but she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. Days went by, and Lily grew more and more attached to the doll. She would carry it everywhere, around the house, outside in the yard, even to bed. At first, Sarah thought it was just a phase, but there was something unsettling about how Lily began to act. She would talk to the doll as though it were a real person, whispering softly to it in a language Sarah couldn't understand. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Sarah noticed something strange. Lily was holding Emmy in her lap, but the doll's eyes seemed to follow her movements around the table. The light flickered briefly, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and Sarah swore she saw the doll's lips curl into a faint, malicious smile. "Mum, Emmy wants to sit next to me," Lily exclaimed, a little too loudly. Sarah froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "Lily," her husband Mark added with a smile, "Emmy can't sit at the table. It's just a doll." But Lily's gaze was fixed on the doll's unblinking eyes. "Emmy says she's real, and she's not a doll." A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she didn't know what to say. She chalked it up to imagination, but that night, as the wind howled outside and snow began to fall heavily, things began to take a darker turn. The whispers returned, low, unintelligible murmurs coming from the living room. Sarah sat up, heart pounding in her chest. The house was cold. colder than it should have been for the middle of December. She could see her breath fogging in the air. Slowly, she crept out of bed and into the hall, following the chilling sound. She gasped when she saw it. The doll was sitting on the armchair by the fireplace. It hadn't been there before. It had been on the shelf, but now it was alive. Its eyes glistened in the firelight, and its fingers twitched ever so slightly. "Mark!" Sarah whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Mark, wake up!" Mark groggily stumbled from the bedroom, confused but alarmed by the fear in her voice. He followed her to the living room, but when he saw the doll, his face twisted with concern. "That's impossible," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Lily appeared in the doorway, holding the doll tightly in her arms. Her expression was vacant, her eyes dull. "Emmy says you shouldn't be scared. She's not going to hurt us. She just wants to stay with me forever." Sarah's heart sank. This wasn't normal. This wasn't her daughter. The room grew colder still, the whispers growing louder, and the doll's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. Sarah turned to Mark, her voice shaking. "We have to get rid of it, now!" But it was too late. The doll had already begun to take control. The next few days were filled with increasing oddities. Sarah and Mark tried to take the doll from Lily, but each time it mysteriously reappeared. They even tried to burn it, but the fire wouldn't touch it. It was as though the doll was invincible, bound to their home, to their daughter. And then one night, Lily vanished. Sarah and Mark searched frantically, calling out for her through the house, but there was no answer. In the silence, a soft, chilling laugh echoed from the living room. They rushed to the source, but when they opened the door, they found Lily sitting there, holding the doll. Her eyes were vacant, her face expressionless, and her voice, though her lips didn't move, whispered in a cold, detached tone, "She's here to stay now. I'm never leaving." And with that, Sarah and Mark realized the horrifying truth. The doll had taken their daughter, had consumed her very soul. It wasn't just a toy, it was a vessel of something ancient, something evil. And now it was far too late to escape. The doll had always been watching, always waiting. And now it had its new home. It was Christmas Eve, and the Johnson family was preparing for the most magical holiday they had ever hoped for. It was their first year spending the season in their new house, a large, creaky old place they had inherited from a distant relative. The house was filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, the Christmas tree glittering in the corner of the living room, and the fireplace crackling merrily. But for 8-year-old Sophie, there was something about the house that made her uneasy. It wasn't the creaky floors or the way the house groaned under the weight of the snowstorm outside. No, it was something more subtle, a feeling of being watched. The first sign that something was wrong came when Sophie found an old, worn elf doll in the attic. It was tucked away in a dusty box, wrapped in a faded red scarf, its glass eyes staring out with an unsettling intensity. Sophie, being a curious child, picked it up and immediately felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There was something about this doll that didn't sit right. It didn't look like any ordinary Christmas decoration. The elf had an old-fashioned design with sharp, pointed features and a mischievous grin that made Sophie uneasy. "Mum, can I keep this?" Sophie asked as she ran downstairs with the doll in her hands. Her mother smiled warmly, setting down a tray of cookies. "Of course, sweetie, it's just a doll, it'll be fine." But Sophie wasn't convinced. That night, as she laid in bed, she could still feel the eyes of the doll watching her from the shelf across the room. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows, but Sophie's thoughts were consumed by the elf. Its unsettling grin seemed to grow wider as she stared at it. Around midnight, Sophie awoke with a start. The room was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moonlight streaming through the window. She felt the cold air around her and immediately knew that something was wrong. The elf doll, was it always sitting there? It couldn't have been. Sophie was sure she had placed it on the shelf before going to bed. But now it was sitting on the edge of her dresser, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight, as though it was watching her every move. Her heart pounded in her chest. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the doll had moved on its own. As she sat up in bed, a soft whisper seemed to fill the room. The voice was faint, distant, but clear enough to send a chill down her spine. "You shouldn't have taken me." Sophie's blood ran cold. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You woke me up. Now you have to remember." Terrified, Sophie bolted out of bed and ran down the stairs to her parents' room. She shook her mother awake, but when they returned to her bedroom, the elf was gone. It was nowhere to be found. The next morning, Sophie tried to put the events out of her mind, but she couldn't. She found the doll tucked neatly in a corner of her room, as though it had never moved. But the whispers had not stopped. They were louder now, echoing in her mind, urging her to remember. As Christmas Day approached, Sophie began to experience strange dreams. She would find herself in the attic again, in front of the same old box where she had found the doll. But this time, there was a presence, an entity that made her feel as though she was not alone. It spoke to her in the dream, its voice cold and ancient. "You took me. Now you will help me remember who I am." One night, Sophie decided she couldn't take it any longer. She climbed into the attic once more, determined to confront whatever was haunting her. As she pulled the box out from the corner of the attic, she found something she had missed before, an old, faded letter tucked under the doll. It was written in elegant handwriting, but the words were disturbing. "I am the forgotten elf. I was once a servant of the old house, bound to protect the family that lived here. But when the family abandoned the house, I was forgotten, left to roam the halls for eternity. The only way to free me is to remember my name." Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker, colder. The whispering voices filled her ears, urging her to say the name aloud. Sophie tried to block them out, but the pressure in her head became unbearable. She reached out and touched the elf doll, her hand shaking. The moment her fingers brushed the elf, the room went silent. Everything froze. And then she heard it, a voice, soft but unmistakable. "Thank you." Sophie's eyes widened in terror as the doll's eyes glowed bright red, its once lifelike face now twisted into a grotesque expression. The walls of the attic seemed to close in around her, and she could feel the cold breath of the forgotten elf on her neck. But before she could scream, everything went dark. The next morning, Sophie's parents found her standing in front of the attic door, her face pale, her eyes empty. She was clutching the elf doll tightly in her arms, its grin wider than ever. They never spoke of it again, but every year, at Christmas, Sophie would sit alone in the attic, whispering to the doll, because now she knew the truth. The forgotten elf would never let her go. Every year, Timmy would write his letter to Santa, filled with hopes and wishes. He was like any other child, innocent, eager, and filled with that magical belief in the jolly man who could bring toys and treats to all the good children. But this year, Timmy's letter was different. His parents didn't know what was in it, but there was something about it that felt off. The night before Christmas, as he climbed into bed, Timmy heard a faint scratching sound coming from the chimney. He froze, heart racing. He had heard the stories about Santa's reindeer landing on the roof, the sleigh bells ringing, but this sound, this was different. It was the sound of something scraping against the walls, something heavier than a sack of toys. Suddenly, he heard a deep voice, low and guttural, echoing through the house. "You think you've been good, Timmy? Think again?" The words chilled him to the core. His breath caught in his throat. Was this Santa? Terrified, Timmy tried to ignore the voice, burying his face in his pillow, hoping it was just a dream. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. The door to his room creaked open, and in the dim light of the hallway, a shadow loomed. He dared a glance. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure in a tattered red suit. His face was hidden beneath a thick white beard, but there was no mistaking the malicious gleam in his eyes. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his hands, twisted and clawed, clutched a list. The figure growled, his voice now a terrifying rasp. "Timmy, you're on the naughty list, and Santa doesn't forget." Timmy's heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be real. Santa was supposed to be kind and jolly, not this. The man in the red suit stepped closer, the air growing colder with each movement. He unfolded the list in his hands, and Timmy's stomach churned as he saw his name written in thick, black ink. But there were others too, names of children Timmy had never heard of. Some of the names were crossed out, while others were circled in red. "Look at what you've done," the man hissed. "Look at the darkness you've embraced." Timmy's mind raced. He didn't know what he had done wrong. He'd been a good boy, hadn't he? He couldn't think of any reason why he would deserve to be on this man's list. Before he could speak, the figure waved his hand, and the room grew darker, the shadows stretching across the walls like creeping vines. The floor beneath Timmy's bed seemed to shift, revealing something that made his blood run cold, a trapdoor. The man in the red suit leaned down, his face inches from Timmy's, his breath foul and icy. "Do you really think you've been good? Your actions, your lies, your selfishness haven't gone unnoticed, and now you'll pay." Timmy opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached forward, grabbing Timmy's arm with a grip so cold it felt like ice was creeping into his bones. The man's eyes, red and glistening, locked onto his, and the room began to spin. Santa's naughty list is a sentence, and once you're on it, there's no escape. With a sudden, violent tug, the man pulled Timmy from his bed and dragged him toward the trapdoor. Timmy struggled, trying to scream, but the darkness was suffocating. The man's grip tightened. "You'll never see the light of day again," the man whispered. Suddenly, the trapdoor opened wide, revealing a vast, endless abyss beneath. It was as if the floor was swallowed by darkness, a deep pit that seemed to stretch forever, and Timmy's body trembled with a terror he couldn't comprehend. Just before he was pulled into the abyss, Timmy saw something. It was a pale, twisted figure wearing a torn Santa suit with hollow, empty eyes staring back at him. It was another child, someone who had been taken, someone who had been on the naughty list too. The man in the red suit released Timmy's arm, but it was too late. He was falling, and the darkness consumed him. His screams echoed into nothingness. The next morning, Christmas morning, the house was silent. Timmy's parents awoke to find his room empty, the bed untouched. The only thing left was the letter to Santa, crumpled on the floor. And at the top of the letter, in big, bold letters, was a message written in thick, red ink. "Naughty or nice, you will never know the difference." It was a crisp winter evening when Claire and her younger brother Max decided to build their annual snowman in the front yard. The first snow of the season had fallen the night before, blanketing the neighborhood in a thick, white layer of powder. The world was peaceful and still, the only sound being the crunch of their boots in the fresh snow. But this year, something was different. There was an eerie feeling in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Max was the first to notice it. As they worked together, rolling large snowballs for the body of the snowman, he kept glancing nervously toward the woods behind their house. Claire, caught up in the excitement of the moment, didn't pay much attention to his uneasy glances. She was too busy arranging the buttons and the scarf. Once the snowman was built, standing tall and proud in the center of the yard, Max insisted on putting the final touch, the coal for the eyes. But as he leaned in to place the pieces, Claire noticed something strange. The snowman's eyes, they weren't quite right. The hollow sockets seemed to shift just slightly, as if they were looking at something. She laughed it off, brushing it off as her imagination running wild. After all, they had built this snowman every year. There was nothing to worry about. That night, as Claire tucked Max into bed, she could still feel that odd tension in the air, though she tried to shake it. The snowstorm outside had intensified, and the wind howled against the windows. Everything seemed normal, but deep down, something felt wrong. Around midnight, Claire was awoken by the sound of something scratching at her window. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like someone tapping gently. She sat up in bed, straining to hear it again. But the wind was louder now, and the tapping grew more insistent. She couldn't see anything from her room, but she had a sickening feeling that whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. Claire stood up, grabbed her flashlight, and tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake Max. As she peered through the front window, she saw the outline of the snowman standing tall in the yard, barely visible through the swirling snow. But something was wrong. The snowman had moved. Its head had tilted, just slightly, as if it was looking at her house. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She squinted, her heart pounding. In the eerie glow of the street lamp, she could swear the snowman's face. No, the snowman's expression had changed. The mouth, once a simple cold grin, was now twisted into a menacing sneer. The eyes, those cold black pits, were now staring directly at her. The tapping sound came again, and this time Claire could hear it coming from the yard. Her heart raced as she backed away from the window. She turned to run upstairs and check on Max, but before she could take a step, the front door creaked open. It was as though it had opened on its own, inviting the cold and the snow inside. Claire froze, terrified. The snowman had somehow made its way inside. As she slowly approached the door, she could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps, crunching snow, getting closer. They weren't coming from outside, but from the hallway right behind her. Max was still asleep, but Claire felt like she was losing control. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. And then, without warning, the cold hand of something icy wrapped around her wrist, pulling her back toward the door. She screamed, but it was no use. The door opened fully, revealing a figure standing outside, tall and imposing, its face a twisted, frozen version of the snowman in the yard. Its cold, lifeless eyes bored into hers. "I warned you," the figure whispered in a voice as cold as death itself. Before Claire could react, the snowman, or whatever it was, lunged at her, its icy fingers digging into her skin. The last thing Claire saw before she blacked out was the grin of the snowman, now stretching wider as if it had a life of its own. The next morning, Claire's parents found the door wide open, and Claire's room empty. Her footsteps were nowhere to be found in the snow outside. Max, still asleep in his bed, was the only sign of life in the house. But when the police arrived, they found something strange in the yard. The snowman, now eerily lifelike, stood as if guarding the house. In the freshly fallen snow around it, there were no footprints, no signs of struggle. Only one thing remained, the coal eyes staring into the distance as though it was waiting for someone else.